Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Want to circle back to the conversation we had last week about Michigan transfer portal targets. And Dill, after that spring game, you get a little bit of a better sense in terms of what positions Michigan should be going after in the transfer portal. And then you got a lot of names in the transfer portal as well. Want to have two different conversations. One, what positions should Michigan most actively be seeking in the transfer portal? And then the second conversation is let's talk about some names for some potential targets for this Michigan program. Really excited to get into this one. Before we do, and as always, just want to say thank you to you guys. As always, a massive shout out to the Michigan fans. Y'all know the fellas are massive Michigan fans, and the amount of support the Michigan fans have shown the boys, whether we're breaking down the spring game, talking the recruiting trail. Cannot thank you guys enough. One, if y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Much more importantly, would love to get some feedback from you guys in the comment section. We had this conversation a little bit earlier last week, and a lot of good feedback in the comment section. A lot of people agreed with some of our takes. A lot of people didn't agree as well. That's what college football is about. We're all putting on our GM hats, trying to figure out how to best get this Michigan team right heading into 2024. Dill, I'm going to give you the T-box first. Let's just talk about positions we would like to see Michigan go after in the transfer portal.
To me, there's only one real position that you make an ultra hard charge, and you kind of can take almost anyone within reason, like a guy of Michigan's caliber. And you can take a depth piece. I think you can take a young guy who's got potential or more proven, and that's that wide receiver spot. Just because you kind of look, I think you still got to fill the talent pipeline coming up. I mean, they have not recruited that position particularly well compared to what they've done every other position, and they don't have a ton of returning production coming in. So I think you can kind of take a broad range of spectrum of type of guy out of the portal. And then probably my other two positions are that linebacker spot. I think they could use another guy on that depth piece. And again, that's more of one that the right fit needs to be out there. I don't think you're taking a middling linebacker in the transfer portal because that doesn't help Michigan really at all. I think they're fine at that depth piece. But I think if they can add an Elijah Herring or something who can give them a little bit of flexibility and that ability to kind of get out there and do it right away, I think that could be helpful. And then defensive tackle, you probably could just take one more depth piece just to add some size, because you did look, there were times with Mason Graham, Kenny Grant not playing a whole lot, Rayshon Benny and Trey Pierce also missing it, that they did get run on a little bit and moved more than you would have wanted.
Yeah, okay, so the wide receiver position, I think every single Michigan fan is in that boat. And specifically, we're looking for, that wide receiver that can work vertically down the field, preferably a bigger frame with some of that physicality down the field. I'll push back against the linebacker room deal. I saw Cole Sullivan play in that spring game and said, you could have sold me on maybe adding a depth piece at the linebacker spot pre-spring game. You watch Cole Sullivan play in that spring game, and this is a freshman that I think we'll be able to rely on in 2024. But I think more importantly, do you really want to throw another linebacker into that room, start taking reps from some of the young guys like Cole Sullivan? I'd probably back off from that one because what you saw with Cole Sullivan, and I think the inside of that defensive line is a really intriguing conversation where I think from a outsider's perspective, right, from a non-Michigan fan perspective, they're going to be saying, well, you got Mason Graham, Kenneth Graham, probably the best interior defensive line duo in the country. Why would you be looking to add? You've already seen Michigan add the guy that we have on the screen right now, CJ West. They offered him last week. Dill, you look at why Michigan's defensive line was so dominant last year, why we had so much success late in the season. Yes, we had the star talent, but we also had a lot of depth. And I think that is something that it's no secret. Michigan wants to win along the line of scrimmage. You want to probably add one or two depth pieces from that inside of that defensive line. And Dill, CJ West, kind of that perfect guy. And we were having the conversation before we went live and how Michigan wants to be kind of versatile with how we have that defensive front. Sounds like we'll be playing with that true nose tackle a little bit more. We know Kenneth Grant can play that. You probably don't want to stick Mason Graham at that nose to kind of, you got to let him cook a little bit. Though CJ West from Kent State, this one would make a lot of sense. It's kind of your too deep at that nose after Kenny Grant.
And that's kind of what I look at, because you got guys like Etta who you don't necessarily want to be playing in that inside the tackle box all the time, just given the size and where probably him continuing to develop that ability to really be stout against big time offensive lines like you'll probably see against Penn State or in Oregon or those type of teams that can get a little bit more physical. I think you do want that one more piece to, again, give you a little more versatility in how you play, what defensive alignments you have, and just have one more guy who I think you can count on to go eat double teams and be really tough on the inside. That's the one thing I don't think you were particularly impressed with in the spring game at times is interior guys getting moved around a little bit.
I do agree. And again, they're going up against a very good offensive line. We had more question marks about the depth at the edge rusher spot. Those were answered. Like TJ Guy, Keyshawn Bennett, like we feel like we're pretty good there.
Rion Ishmael?
Yeah,
Shout
we
out
had
to
guys step
He
up.
was awesome.
It was a really good performance by the edge rushers. I'm with you. You look on the inside and say, could maybe add a few bodies. Two things on CJ West. One, not necessarily the flashiest player, elite against the run, 24 run stops and average depth of tackle of 0.9 yards down the field. He's got that perfect nose tackle body, built like a fire hydrant. From Nazareth Academy, we've had some success with some football players from Nazareth Academy, J.J. McCarthy coming from there. Dill, I think this one would make a lot of sense. And how about some news from earlier this morning where you got Michigan State's, in my mind, best player on their team hitting the transfer portal in Derek Carman from Detroit, Michigan, a guy that, again, is a dominant force on the inside of that defensive line. And it makes me think about the kind of like three musketeers we had last year, Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant, Chris Jenkins. Derek Carman potentially coming to Michigan. I mean, if we had questions about how good this inside of the defensive line was, you have no questions about adding a guy like Derek Carman.
And there is that element of like, is it harder to sell one of those real top end talents like Derek Carman? Because Derek Carman's really good. I don't think he's better than Kenny Grant or Mason Graham, just because those two, I mean, they're horses. They're as good as you got in the country. But you take a guy like Derek Carman, who I think wants to win in getting towards the end of his college career and also get a really probably good draft bump. I mean, Michigan, the way they've been developing guys at that position and just getting to play with the defensive front that Michigan has, I think you can be really productive and put a really good season. So, yeah, you look from the state of Michigan, or the Detroit area at that, so obviously in Michigan's backyard, I think Michigan can be an attractive destination potentially for a guy like Derek Carman, because if he's looking at the draft, no one's doing it better in Michigan right now in the D-line.
We had some success with the three, like rotational pieces. I don't think Chris Jenkins or Kenneth Graham were complaining about not getting enough opportunity playing on the Michigan defensive line. It's no secret we want to rotate these guys in and out. And Bill, some of the defensive linemen that you saw, like I could see all three of them being on the field, right? You got Kenny Grant at the nose. You got the three techs being Derek Carman and Mason Graham.
Especially with the versatility that Graham and Harmon have, especially. I mean, Mason Graham can play anywhere. I'm pretty confident he'd be just fine lining up as a true edge rusher on most plays. He's got
to do that once in the spring game.
100%. So Mason Graham can line up that way. Derek Harmon's a relatively lean 320-pound guy at 6'5". I mean, he's a guy who moves really well for that size and can play versatile. And you saw the versatility of what Michigan was doing in the spring game. I think there's plenty of room for three really good defensive tackles in that group, especially when you have two really versatile ones in Carman and Graham.
Yeah, and I guess to close out the conversation on the inside of the defensive line, it's not an obvious position of concern like the wide receiver room is. That being said, I don't think it's a coincidence that Sherrone Moore offers CJ West. I think his first offer of the spring transfer portal window. So I think it is. We might see Michigan add a guy on the inside of the defensive line. Now the question is, who is it going to be? CJ West will be on campus, I believe, later this week visiting Michigan. Bill, let's get into the main event, and that is the wide receiver room. I want to start with, you talk about perfect fits and kind of what we're looking for this Michigan wide receiver room. It's a big body that can work vertically down the field, and that is proven at the Power 5 level. You look at Sam Brown from Houston and say, this is a guy that had over 800 receiving yards at Houston, ran a 4.45 coming out of high school, a 6'2", 200-pound frame. This is the ideal wide receiver that Michigan is looking for in the transfer portal.
And this is going to be the task for Kirk Campbell and Ron Bellamy, is to make this a more attractive destination for wideouts, because you've seen the past couple years, it hasn't been that. It's been a really attractive destination for offensive linemen, very attractive destination for running backs, and very attractive for tight ends. So you just haven't seen them quite get any rhythm, it feels like, or momentum with that wide receiver group. But I mean, it is a place that if you're that type of guy, Sam Brown, you probably come in as arguably that number one, especially on the edge doing what he does, because Morris and Samaj Morgan are great. We know that, but they don't really do what Sam Brown does. I think Sam Brown, that type of wide receiver, that true X wide receiver, I think should be able to take a look at Michigan. But again, that will be the task for Kirk Campbell as to how do you get that elite presence on the field? How do you sell your offense to that guy?
That's an interesting conversation that you just got into in terms of, all right, Michigan, maybe not the most attractive destination for wide receivers. It hasn't really been an offense where wide receivers are putting up crazy numbers. On the flip side, this could be a very attractive destination because you have an opportunity to slide in and have a lot of playing time. Because you look at this Michigan wide receiver room and say, we got like what? 5 wide receivers, 6 wide receivers on scholarship total that aren't true freshmen. And Michigan fans might need to track my numbers on that, but it's not a lot. And it's certainly not a lot of proven production, right? We know Samaj Morgan, Tyler Morris. I'm optimistic about Freddie Moore coming out of the spring game. Got a guy like O'Leary, Ronnie Bell's little brother, Kendrick Bell.
No.
Yeah, like we got some guys, but not a ton of proven production. Sam Brown comes in, I think could be kind of that featured part in that offense. One other guy that Michigan did offer out of the portal. Now, it sounds like he's going to USC, but for a lot of Michigan fans, it makes us feel good that at least Michigan's going after a guy like this. And that's Kyle Ford. He's a former 5-star coming out of high school, 6'3", 220 pounds, big body that works vertically. Again, probably not going to get him as it sounds like he's going to go to USC, but it's nice to see Michigan identifying Kyle Ford as a guy we need, offering him, and at least making an effort to get him to Ann Arbor.
And I do appreciate that Kirk Campbell kind of went out and said it and was a little bit more forthcoming than maybe you've seen Jim Harbaugh and Jim Harbaugh's staff in the past, where they say nothing. It's very tight-lipped, and we just go off what the beat reporters say and whatever news they think they get. So to come out there and say they're going to try to do it and make it a priority very clearly, I didn't mind, because again, you're kind of right. It hasn't seemed like a priority for Michigan in the past, and that's been great. It's worked, obviously, but you do want some of those like tier 1, A1 wide receivers. There's a reason those guys are getting paid the way they do in the NFL. There's a reason the teams like Ohio State, in Alabama and Georgia have had really good offenses. They have explosive wide receivers. So again, you want to see Michigan try to at least get one of those guys, if not 2, in this transfer portal window.
Last wide receiver I want to mention, and this is a little bit more off the beaten path, but Antonio Gates Jr. Couple things I like. One, very good bloodlines. Son of Antonio Gates, the all-pro tight end, for the Los Angeles Chargers, from Michigan, transferring from Michigan State. Dill, this was a guy that you read the Michigan State spring practice notes and say, this is a dude in that Michigan State offense. He ends up hitting the transfer portal. Another guy that checks a lot of boxes in terms of a big physical wide receiver that can go on the boundary, although I don't think works vertically down the field with all of that speed. He's very, very good at the catch point, gives you that physical presence. Another wide receiver that I think would be, interesting for Michigan to kick the tires on. Last position that I want to kind of mention here, we're not going to go to the off-ball linebacker spot, but Dill, I want to go to the cornerback spot. And I feel very good about the cornerback spot leaving the spring game, which is kind of the opposite of what we were feeling 12 months ago, where we watched that spring game, watched Marion Walker kind of get cooked and say, yeah, we got to go get a guy like Josh Wallace. I don't feel that way heading into 2024, but there was a very good cornerback that in my mind is the best cornerback available in the transfer portal. And that's Taran Spooks from Texas, a guy that was a top 100 national prospect coming out of high school. Dill has played really good for Texas when he's been on the field. We watched the spring game of him on Saturday. Looks phenomenal there. You think about Will Johnson, Terrence Brooks being that cornerback duo for Michigan in 2024. This is a guy that I think Michigan would warmly welcome.
And frankly, obviously a guy who probably can't go to the SEC, so that removes a big chunk of the potential suitors from that group. You kind of narrow it down to like Miami out of the ACC and then a couple of Big Ten schools. Michigan, Ohio State, USC, and Oregon are the only ones I can really think of that feel like they have the attractiveness and the firepower to go after a guy like this. So, he's kind of out there for the Big Ten's taking. And he's another guy who I mean, they haven't gotten the most out of him at Texas. I don't think anyone
No.
would argue that. You saw what Texas' numbers were in the secondary. He's a guy who, again, you've seen the athleticism, you've seen the ability to stay with guys, hasn't always played the ball particularly great in the air, and just hasn't developed in the way I think you can, given what you've seen with the flash of the talent. So, again, you come to Michigan, where you're playing in a scheme that's been extremely effective in terms of allowing guys to shine. I mean, Josh Wallace comes in and makes a name for himself year one. You've obviously seen Will Johnson emerge as the best cornerback, in my opinion, by far in college football. This is a defense that I think's been really good to secondary players. I think that position might be open, at least to compete at, given that you kind of have two young guys who are relatively unproven. Michigan, again, it's not necessarily the guy they usually go after, but I think given some of the circumstances, this could be a really attractive destination.
It would be an intriguing one. And again, I don't think that again, going back to last year, it was, for lack of better terms, desperation mode. Like this is a big problem. We really do not have a guy we trust at that cornerback 2 spot. I think you got 2 guys in Jair Hill and DJ Waller that you trust. And so I'm not necessarily saying Michigan needs to go out and get desperate for a guy like Taran Spooks, but he is an extremely talented, high upside cornerback that I think unarguably makes this Michigan roster better. We'll continue to monitor it as the kind of plays out, as we get some more names in the transfer portal. Though maybe we'll look at some off-ball linebackers next episode. Appreciate you guys.
Come home to Brian Jean-Marie. That's an obvious one.
Elijah Herring would be absolutely
play Colorado, play Michigan football.
Kyle Green's a guy too. All right, we'll wrap it up on that. Appreciate you guys rocking with the boys again. We would love to hear from y'all in the comment section. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.